Not a single dime. That's not frustration talking. That's not a few upset fans venting after a disappointing offseason. That is a coordinated, financially motivated withdrawal of support from the exact people who built Indiana Fever into the most talked about franchise in women's sports. The people who packed arenas they weren't even playing in. The people who crashed merchandise servers. The people who turned a mid-table WNBA franchise into the hottest ticket in the entire league practically overnight. And they are now telling the Indiana Fever front office directly, publicly, in comment sections and podcasts and social media threads that they are done spending money until this organization proves it deserves it back. That should terrify the front office. And if it doesn't, that's an even bigger problem. Because what we're looking at right now isn't one bad decision that can be walked back with a press conference or a well-timed trade. It's 3 decisions made in sequence that, when you line them up side by side, reveal something far more unsettling than incompetence. They reveal a front office that may not fully understand the once-in-a-generation asset sitting in their locker room. And in professional sports, that particular kind of misunderstanding has a very specific, very painful historical track record. We're going to lay all 3 of those decisions out today, in order, with the receipts. By the time we're done, you're going to understand not just what Indiana did wrong, but why the pattern of those mistakes matters more than any single move in isolation. Because patterns tell you something intentions never will. Let's get into it. Before you can understand why the fan reaction has been this severe, you have to understand what Caitlin Clark actually represents at a structural level. Not emotionally, not culturally, structurally, financially, economically. Television contracts moved because of her, not shifted slightly, moved. Broadcast partners who had been treating WNBA airtime as a scheduling obligation suddenly started treating it as premium inventory. Franchise valuations across the league expanded in ways that would have been completely unimaginable 3 years ago. Cities that hadn't paid serious attention to women's basketball in over a decade were selling out buildings on the strength of one name on the visiting team's roster. Clark doesn't just make the Indiana Fever competitive, she finances the WNBA's entire growth narrative. Every team in this league benefits financially from what she is doing for the sport's national brand. Sponsorship dollars accelerated league-wide. Expansion franchise pricing hit numbers that made front offices who hadn't even started playing yet look like shrewd investors simply because Clark existed in the same league. That is the scale of what we're talking about. And here's the part that changes the accountability framework entirely. The Indiana front office did not build any of that. They inherited it. Clark arrived and detonated a trajectory that the organization had been struggling to sustain for years. Before she got there, the Fever were operating in relative obscurity, championship history in the record books, but fading momentum in a league that was rapidly evolving around them. Clark's arrival didn't course-correct that situation. It obliterated the old ceiling entirely and replaced it with something nobody had ever seen in women's basketball. Attendance records fell, not just in Indianapolis, but everywhere Indiana traveled. Home games sold out in patterns the franchise hadn't experienced in years. TV ratings for Fever games outperformed every projection the networks had modeled heading into the season, and in multiple instances went head-to-head with men's professional basketball airing simultaneously on competing channels and held their own. The front office didn't engineer any of that. They received it. And that distinction is exactly why what they chose to do with it this offseason carries the weight that it does. When you build something, you understand its mechanics. You know which decisions protect it and which ones quietly erode it. When you inherit something, that understanding has to be learned. And the evidence from this offseason suggests the Indiana front office is still in the learning phase, which would be acceptable, except the cost of learning on the job with this particular asset is not something the fan base is willing to absorb quietly. The Stephanie White hire was where the trust started cracking. On the surface, it looked like a defensible decision.
White brings legitimate coaching credentials. She knows the WNBA landscape from multiple angles, as a player, as an assistant, as a head coach. She carries an institutional steadiness that Indiana genuinely needed after a turbulent first season with Clark, navigating the transition from college superstar to professional floor general. Nobody was expecting the Fever to find a perfect fit on their first attempt at building a coaching staff around a player of Clark's profile. Reasonable people could look at the hire and at least follow the logic. Then White opened her mouth about how she intended to use Caitlin Clark, and the entire conversation changed in an instant. White expressed a preference for deploying Clark in a more off-ball capacity. The framing was about system balance, about collective movement, about not over-relying on any single creator. But what fans heard underneath that framing was something far more specific and far more alarming. They heard a head coach describe the most electric offensive talent in the sport as a secondary weapon, a corner operator, a player who would function within the system rather than as the mechanism the system was designed around. To understand why that comment hit the way it did, you have to sit with one number for a moment without any comparison attached to it: 8 assists per game. That is what Caitlin Clark averaged in her first-year professional season. 8 assists per game as a first-year player in a league where veteran point guards who have spent a decade refining their craft routinely peak around 5 or 6. She was reading defensive rotations before they finished forming. She was pushing pace in transition with a decisiveness that drew legitimate comparisons to elite NBA playmaking. Not flattery, actual tactical comparisons from people who study offensive systems for a living. She was threading passes into windows that required anticipating where defenders would be 3 movements from now, not where they currently stood. Her entire value as a basketball player, the reason she transformed a franchise, the reason broadcast partners started paying attention, the reason arenas filled regardless of which city Indiana was visiting, is built entirely on the freedom to function as a primary creator. She is not a complementary piece who happens to have a reliable handle and a good shot. She is the engine. The offense generates value because Clark is running it, not because the system occasionally puts her in a position to be useful. Constraining that role doesn't refine her production. It disconnects the offense from the only thing that makes it dangerous in the first place. Now here's where the White hire goes from questionable to genuinely concerning. This isn't just about one comment made at one press availability. White has a documented coaching philosophy that has been consistent across multiple stops in her career. She prioritizes systems where collective ball movement takes precedence over isolating individual creators. That philosophy has produced real results in certain roster contexts. It is not without merit in the right situation. The problem is that a Clark-centered offense requires the exact opposite orientation. You don't design a system and then ask Clark to create within its constraints. You design the collective around her ability to create and build every other element outward from that central reality. Those are 2 fundamentally different frameworks, and Indiana chose a head coach whose entire professional record points toward the wrong one for their specific roster situation. Fans weren't reacting emotionally to the White hire. The discourse that followed was analytically specific and structurally grounded. People were pointing to the documented mismatch between what makes Clark uniquely valuable and what White has historically prioritized in the systems she runs. That is not a vibe. That is an observation with real evidence behind it. And then, before that conversation had even fully resolved itself, the front office made the second decision. What Indiana did in free agency didn't just add fuel to an existing fire. It introduced a structural problem that no amount of positive press coverage can paper over. The Fever brought in players who had publicly positioned themselves against the Caitlin Clark phenomenon, not through basketball competition, which would have been completely fine, but through deliberate nationally broadcast media appearances that framed Clark's cultural rise in directly adversarial terms. players who sat in front of cameras with national audiences and made statements that Clark's supporters found not just dismissive, but carefully constructed to undermine her. Players who described Clark's fan base in language that positioned those fans as enemies rather than as fellow supporters of the sport. Players who, during their own team's playoff pushes, still couldn't separate their public identity from commentary about Clark's media coverage, about the attention she receives, about what her rise supposedly represents for players who were in the league before she arrived.
This is not subtext. It is not inference or interpretation. The appearances are on video. The timestamps exist. Anyone can pull them up and watch the specific words being used in the specific context they were delivered. There is no ambiguity about what was said or what it was designed to communicate. Now, the Indiana Fever front office looked at all of that and signed those players anyway. Let's be precise about what that decision actually means beyond the obvious public relations problem. When White stood in front of cameras and emphasized that chemistry and locker room cohesion were organizational priorities, she was making a statement that now has to be read against a very specific backdrop. When front office leadership talked about building a culture that would support Clark's development and competitive environment, those statements now exist alongside the documented reality that they actively chose to import athletes whose public relationship with Clark is contentious at best and openly hostile at worst. You cannot claim to be protecting locker room culture while simultaneously recruiting documented tension into the room. The contradiction isn't subtle enough to be missed. It isn't buried in organizational speak or press conference framing. It is sitting in plain sight for anyone who watched what those players said on television and then noticed their names in the Indiana Fever's free agency announcements. The fan base noticed immediately. Comment sections, podcasts, Twitter threads, YouTube replies. The conversation has been running continuously since the signings were announced, and it is not trending toward acceptance. People are not getting tired of the story. They're getting more specific in their analysis of what it means. And what it means when you strip away all the roster justifications and athletic credentials and talk about chemistry as an organizational value is that Indiana chose a short-term basketball calculation over a long-term cultural reality. Whether those players can contribute on the court in a vacuum is beside the point. The point is that the locker room Clark walks into every day now contains people whose documented stance toward her public identity was adversarial, and the organization made that choice with full knowledge of the record. That is not a perception problem. That is a structural problem dressed up as a personnel decision. The moment the fan response crystallized from frustration into something more organized happened publicly and with remarkable clarity. Indiana's social media team posted promotional content encouraging fans to purchase single-game tickets for the upcoming season. Standard procedure, completely routine, the kind of post franchises across every professional league put out dozens of times per year without a second thought. The replies did not reflect enthusiasm. What flooded those comment sections wasn't the usual mix of excitement and casual complaints about ticket pricing. It was a coordinated, independently arrived-at decision by thousands of individual fans to publicly announce that they were withholding financial support until the organization demonstrated it had earned it back. Different accounts, different writing styles, different cities, different demographics, all landing on the same conclusion through their own reasoning. Not a single dime. The sentiment threading through those replies wasn't impulsive, it was principled in a very specific way. These fans weren't reacting to a losing season or a rough stretch of games, they were reacting to organizational decisions made during the offseason with full information available, and they had concluded that spending money on a franchise that appeared to be building around its franchise players' limitations rather than her strengths was something they were no longer willing to do. Here is why that matters far beyond the optics of a bad comment section. The fans making that calculation publicly are not casual observers who discovered women's basketball during a viral clip and will drift away by midsummer. They are the deeply invested, analytically engaged supporters who drove every metric that made Clark's first season historically significant. These are the people who bought plane tickets to road games in cities they had no other reason to visit, the people who wore Clark's jersey in arenas where she was the visiting player. The people who generated merchandise revenue numbers that made league executives do double takes at their quarterly reports. The people who turned Clark's road appearances into guaranteed sellouts for home teams that have been struggling to fill their own buildings. Losing that audience is not a social media sentiment problem. It is a revenue problem with a very specific shape. In a league where individual team financial margins remain thin and where the infrastructure for sustained commercial growth is still being built, a motivated withdrawal of support from your highest spending, most engaged fan segment compounds quickly. It doesn't just reduce ticket sales, it reduces merchandise revenue. It reduces the organic social media amplification that drives casual fans toward the product. It reduces the word-of-mouth culture that makes an arena feel like the place to be, rather than just another sporting event.
The Fever's front office generated those fans through Clark's arrival. They did not cultivate them through years of organizational excellence and strategic brand building. They received them as part of the package, and they are now watching those same fans publicly announce the conditions under which they will stop showing up. That conversation, if it continues into the regular season, will get the attention of stakeholders who operate far above the Fever's front office pay grade. Everything we've covered so far could theoretically be explained by organizational inexperience. Coaching hires are difficult. Free agency decisions involve compromises that aren't always visible from the outside. Locker room dynamics are complicated. You could, if you were being generous, construct a narrative in which each of those first two decisions represented a front office learning in real time and making defensible calls with incomplete information. The Raven Johnson pick in the draft makes that generosity nearly impossible to maintain. With the 10th overall selection in the 2025 WNBA draft, Indiana chose a defensively oriented point guard from South Carolina. Johnson is a legitimate defensive player, elite instincts, capable of disrupting opposing playmakers, useful as a defensive specialist in a bench role. In isolation, as a basketball player, the credentials are real. None of that is the problem. The problem is that Indiana already had Caitlin Clark at the point guard position. The problem is that they already had established guard depth with existing roster holdovers at the same spot. The problem is that selecting Johnson created a three-point guard roster at the precise position where Indiana already had a generational advantage. They used a top 10 draft pick to add a third option at the one spot on the roster where they were already operating from a position of overwhelming strength. Meanwhile, the actual roster need was sitting in plain sight for anyone who watched Indiana's 2024 playoff run with honest eyes. Aaliyah Boston is one of the most complete centers in the WNBA. Her ability to operate inside, facilitate ball movement, and anchor the defense gives Indiana a legitimate foundational piece around which to build a championship-caliber roster. None of that matters if she is running on empty in the fourth quarter of elimination games because the team has no reliable backup big capable of giving her meaningful rest. That is not a hypothetical vulnerability. It happened in real playoff games with real stakes. Boston was visibly running out of gas in closing situations because the roster had no depth behind her at the center position. The Fever carried that structural failure out of last season into an offseason with a top 10 draft pick available and chose to add a third point guard instead of addressing the documented weakness that ended their season. A defensive-oriented center, a stretch forward who could space the floor and create driving lanes for Clark, a versatile wing capable of guarding multiple positions across the front court. Any of those additions would have directly targeted the specific limitations that ended Indiana's 2024 campaign. The front office had a top 10 selection to work with and chose none of them. Now run the salary cap math on what that decision actually cost. Between the newly acquired guard depth and existing backup contracts at the point guard position, Indiana now has approximately $700,000 committed to backup guard options. In a league where total team salary caps operate in the low millions and where roster building efficiency is measured in thousands rather than millions, that figure represents a substantial portion of available payroll invested entirely in positional redundancy.
$700,000 committed to depth at the position where your franchise player is already the best option in the league is not a philosophical curiosity. It is opportunity cost made tangible. That same allocation could have funded a meaningful upgrade at center, directly extending Boston's effectiveness in high-stakes situations and addressing the exact vulnerability that defined Indiana's postseason limitations. Instead, it is sitting in a backup guard rotation behind a player who will never need backing up. And then, as if to confirm that the front office understood exactly how this would land, Indiana's social media team posted 10 consecutive pieces of content promoting the Johnson selection in the hours immediately following the pick. Highlight clips, graphics, reaction footage, all in rapid succession, all before the backlash had even had time to fully form. For context, previous draft selections under less controversial circumstances generated 2 or 3 posts before the team moved on to other content. 10 posts in immediate succession before the backlash even started.
That volume tells you something the organization would never state publicly. They knew. They made the decision anyway, and then they attempted to manufacture enthusiasm that their actual fan base was not going to produce organically. The strategy did not work. Analytically informed fans pushed back immediately, specifically, and with structurally clean arguments that the promotional blitz had no answer for. Drafting a backup for a backup at the 10th overall pick is a fundamental misallocation of premium draft capital. That case does not get weaker just because the team posts more graphics. The LeBron James comparison has been circulating in fan discourse for weeks, and the people making it are not being dramatic, they are being historically accurate. Cleveland believed LeBron would never leave Ohio. The emotional ties were real, the geographic loyalty was genuine, his connection to the community ran deep in ways that seemed permanent. Front office leadership operated for years with the implicit assumption that James's attachment to his home state would absorb whatever organizational decisions they made around him. That loyalty would function as a constant, regardless of how the roster was constructed or how intelligently the team was managed. And for a long time, they were right. LeBron stayed through rosters that limited him. He stayed through coaching situations that misread his capabilities. He stayed through front office decisions that a player of his profile could not have been satisfied with. He stayed because the emotional ledger still had enough in it to outweigh the competitive frustration. Until it didn't. Until the organizational reality made staying feel like choosing to limit his own competitive legacy. And he made the only decision that made sense from that vantage point. He left. What followed in Cleveland was jersey burnings because the city had convinced itself that love is unconditional. It is not. Loyalty in professional sports is a transaction. It survives as long as both parties are investing proportionally. The moment the organizational side of that transaction starts consistently withdrawing more than it deposits, the calculation changes, not emotionally, but mathematically. Caitlin Clark is under contract through the 2028 season. Nobody is suggesting she requests a trade tomorrow or walks out of a practice this week. That is not the point. The point is that the decisions being made in Indianapolis right now, the coaching philosophy, the roster construction, the locker room dynamics, are writing entries into a ledger that will be reviewed in 2028. Every organizational move that constrains Clark rather than amplifying her is a recorded entry. Every resource misallocation that leaves her carrying competitive weight the roster should be distributing more evenly is a recorded entry. Every structural contradiction between what the front office says it values and what its decisions actually reveal is a recorded entry. The fan base is doing the math on those entries with remarkable consistency and clarity. The corporate sponsors attached to Clark's commercial identity are doing the same calculation from a different angle. They purchased something specific when they attached their brands to her marketing footprint. They purchased Clark succeeding in a high-visibility, high-winning context that validates the association.
Every front office decision that reduces the probability of that outcome introduces uncertainty into relationships Indiana cannot afford to compromise. Television broadcast partners scheduled premium airtime around Fever games with specific expectations about what they were paying for. Competitive basketball from an organization built to maximize its star. What Indiana assembled this offseason creates legitimate questions about whether that delivery is achievable. Questions that networks will be tracking in real time from the opening tip of the regular season. The commercial infrastructure surrounding Clark is not endlessly patient. It is built on performance expectations and competitive outcomes, and it is watching. Here is the part that makes this situation genuinely difficult rather than simply frustrating. The talent case for Indiana winning a championship is real. It is not manufactured optimism or fan projection. It is an honest assessment of what is actually sitting in that roster if the organizational pieces around it align correctly. The Fever were one game from the WNBA Finals last season. One game, with a first-year Caitlin Clark who was still calibrating to the pace and physicality of professional basketball in real time, still absorbing defensive schemes that had been designed with months of film preparation specifically to limit her, still finding her footing in a league where the margin for rookie adjustment is measured in fractions.
A Clark entering her second season with a full year of WNBA defensive reads absorbed, a complete training camp with her new roster, and the competitive instincts that only playoff experience can deposit into a player's understanding of high-stakes basketball, should be measurably more dangerous than the version Indiana fans watched last year. The ceiling is genuinely high. There is no responsible analysis that pretends otherwise. The question is whether organizational intelligence is aligned with athletic talent in a way that actually allows that ceiling to be reached. The fan base has set a threshold for retroactive vindication that is difficult to clear. Championship or bust is not a rallying slogan for social media. It is a conditional statement with a very specific logic. If and only if Indiana wins a championship in 2025, does this front office earn retrospective credit for every decision that has been questioned this offseason. A conference finals run doesn't clear it. A finals appearance doesn't close the ledger. The bar has been placed at the title because that is the only outcome that would prove the decisions were strategically sound rather than fortunate. Championship-level results in professional sports are the exception in any given season, even for rosters built with flawless organizational logic. For a roster carrying the structural contradictions Indiana introduced this offseason, the probability of achieving that outcome becomes demonstrably harder to calculate with confidence. The coaching philosophy misalignment is real. The locker room tension is documented. The roster construction gap at the center position was not addressed. All three of those realities will play out on the court in real time, beginning with the first game of the regular season. There is no controlling the narrative once the games start. There is only the record. And the record is exactly what the fan base, the broadcast partners, the corporate sponsors, and the rest of the league will be reading. The most consequential window in WNBA history is open right now. Caitlin Clark is 23 years old. She is entering just her second professional season with a fan base that is proven, with purchasing behavior and physical attendance and commercial engagement, that it will follow her anywhere she competes. The question that defines this franchise for the next decade is not whether they can be competitive. Clark guarantees a baseline of relevance and commercial viability, regardless of the decisions made around her. That is simply what she is. The question is whether this front office can recognize that championship windows are not built on star power alone. They require the organizational intelligence to surround that star with the right system, the right roster architecture, and a locker room culture genuinely oriented around her success. Indiana has the star. Whether they have the other three pieces is precisely what the 2025 season is about to expose.
And when you consider that the answer to that question doesn't just affect Indiana's trophy case, but affects the trajectory of an entire league at the most pivotal moment in its commercial history, the stakes attached to what happens inside that building this summer become something that goes well beyond one team's off-season decisions. That ledger is open. Every game this season writes in it, and the fans who said not a single dime will be watching every entry more closely than anyone else in the building.